Welcome, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Stephanie Siegel. I'm a member of the Bretton Woods Committee, also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Ayhan Kose, who's the principal author of the recently released World Bank Global Economic Prospects Report. Ayhan, for those who don't know, is the Deputy Chief Economist at the World Bank Group. He's also the director of the Prospects Group, and it's in that capacity that he leads the bank's global macroeconomic outlook, financial flows, and commodity markets work. Under his leadership, the Prospects Group produces the bank's flagship reports, including the Global Economic Prospects and the Commodity Markets Outlook Report. Prior to joining the World Bank, Ayhan was for many years the assistant to the director of the research department at the International Monetary Fund. So we're just thrilled to have him with us today. Just a note on the structure of today's event. Ayhan's going to present for around 20 minutes on the findings of the most recent report. I will join them for a brief moderated discussion, and then we'll have a lot of time for audience question and answer. So I do hope that you'll provide your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So with that, let's dive in. First, I just want to say, again, thank you, Ayhan, and my compliments to you on a very comprehensive and detailed report. Every time I see this report, as well as the flagship reports from the IMF, I just think of these reports are such an incredible global public good to have these resources available and publicly, globally disseminated. So there's a tremendous amount of excellent analysis in this report, and just want to commend you for that. If my AI assistant is correct, the Global Economic Prospects Report was first published in 1998, and now in 2025, this report presents both an opportunity to look at the near-term outlook and also to look back at the past 25 years to assess how emerging market and developing economy prospects have evolved. I have to say, one of the things that really caught my eye in reviewing the report is just the stability in top-line growth, looking both historically, recently, and then into the outlook for 2025 and 26. There's a tremendous amount of stability in headline growth. And at the same time, we know that there is a lot of uncertainty in the global economic outlook, a lot of policy uncertainty. So this presentation, I think, is going to be a great opportunity to hear how your group is thinking about synthesizing both this kind of headline stability, but a lot of uncertainty under the surface. It just underscores how timely this conversation is. And again, thank you, Ayhan, for joining us. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and let me thank colleagues at the Bretton Woods Committee for inviting me to talk about the latest edition of the Global Economic Prospects Report. What I would like to do, I would like to show some slides first, very quickly, and then we can have a hopefully good conversation about the state of the global economy. Let me try to share what I want to. Okay, good. So you can see the slides now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Now, so the Global Economic Prospects Report comes out twice a year. It has been actually around since the 70s. It used to be a part of World Development Report, WDR. Eventually, in the early 90s, under Larry Summers, it became an independent report. Each edition has the usual global and regional forecasts, as well as a couple of analytical chapters. So what I will do today to basically set the stage, ask three questions. The first one, what are the near-term prospects for the global economy? And then the second question is going to focus on these two analytical chapters we have. We are taking stock of the first quarter of this 21st century from the perspective of emerging market developing economies and low-income countries. We have these, acronyms this audience is quite familiar with emerging developing economies, EMDs, and the LICs, low-income countries. So that will be my second question. How have these countries performed in the first quarter of the century, 2025 being the last year of the first quarter? And the third question is, what are the policy priorities going forward, which I will keep very short. So let me start with the first question. What are the near-term prospects for the global economy? Now, the key phrase to describe the state of the global growth, it is stable, but not good enough. So now, I think this figure is just speaks volumes. As you can see, for the world economy, advanced economies, emerging developing economies, what we see is remarkable stability in growth. For the world, we are expecting around 2.7% this year, which was the number in 2023, 2024, as well as 2023, and we think it's going to be the number in 2026. Why do we think we have this stability? There is this, of course, monetary policy easing, and inflation is coming down in many parts of the world. And there are these countries, some of them are doing extremely well, US, and then some of them are slowing, like China. For the advanced economies, growth is going to be around 1.7%, and there US is really compensating others, the weakness in euro area and other economies, even though we are expecting some of these economies to do well, while the US economy is moderating from 24 to 25. But still, the US growth really phenomenal relative to its potential growth against the background of the, one of the tightest, steepest cycles we have seen on the part of monetary policy. With respect to emerging developing economies, growth, again, is quite stable, around 4%. But if you take out China and India, you see the growth actually picking up in that group. That's primarily because of we are expecting global trade to pick up a little bit, and many of these economies to reduce interest rates and gain a little bit of momentum because of that. So this stable growth, as much as, stable, it is not good enough. And the answer why it is not good enough is this, on this figure as well. It is lower than what we saw in the decade prior to the pandemic. On average, growth was around 3.1%. So this is quite a step down relative to that at the global level for emerging developing economies as well as for advanced economies. And that is a huge challenge when I talk about the review of the first quarter of this century. I will I'll delve into this issue a bit more. But now, as much as there is stability, there is significant uncertainty around these forecasts, and that's because of the risks we see. And those risks really all around us, well-known risks. What's number one risk? Really the adverse policy shifts, especially on the part of some advanced economies, with that heightened policy uncertainty. And this policy uncertainty is somewhat underappreciated because certain policies get a lot of attention. But the policy uncertainty is at the highest level since the pandemic. And if you take out the pandemic, actually highest level since the beginning of the 21st century. Now, this trade policy is a major reason for that. But there are also other policies in the context of fiscal and monetary policy. There is a significant uncertainty about the direction of policies, not just in the US, in other parts of the world. Trade fragmentation is still a risk, but that has been already underway, basically manifesting itself in different forms. And of course, conflict and geopolitical tensions, especially what we see in Europe, in the Middle East. And we are living in an era of conflict, the number of conflicts at the highest level since the Second World War, and that has huge consequences going forward. We are worried about the persistently high interest rates. And the reason for that, there's a possibility we might end up actually inflation being persistent or climbing up again. In our baseline, we think inflation will come down um, in many parts of the world, but that is this risk. It won't be in the way we are envisioning. Related to that, financial stress is a big issue. I will explain why. That's related to debt. And then, of course, the climate-related challenges, the frequency and the cost of those disasters have been increasing at a rapid pace, not just, in developing economies, also in advanced economies, as we saw recently in the United States. There are some upside risks. There's a possibility of much faster monetary policy easing with lower inflation. That could happen because we might see lower commodity prices. It would happen because we might see some loss of momentum in activity, especially on the part of services. And um, there is this upside risk associated with stronger growth, especially in China and the United States. In the US, that could happen because US economy really surprised on the upside over the past 4 years. It can surprise on the upside again, primarily because of how strong the US consumer, the household balance sheets, and investment. On the part of China, policymakers put in place certain policies last year. They might bring more support to the economy this year. So briefly, let me try to quantify some of these risks and their implications. There is obviously a lot of interest when it comes to US trade policy. And I would say there's a cottage industry of scenarios when it comes to how these tariffs will shape and what will be the implications. In the report, we look at this very stylized example. What happens, US basically puts this 10% uniform tariff on all of its trade partners that will translate into about 0.3 percentage points decline in global growth. So from 2.7 to 2.4, if there is retaliation by these trade partners, that will also have a significant impact on the growth of emerging developing economies. The other big risk is the risk of this even higher policy uncertainty. And that policy uncertainty, of course, is like a silent killer when it comes to economic growth. It impedes investment, it impedes consumption. It can have a meaningful, significant impact on the growth and could reduce growth, give and take 0.1 percentage point. Now, there is this possibility of strong economic growth in China and the US. With that, you will have, of course, much better growth outcomes. Take, for example, US. If the US economy delivers point percentage point higher growth, that will translate into almost 3% higher output over a 3-year period in emerging market developing economies. Now, I talked about the interest rates. As you see on this left panel, interest rates used to be very low. And really, the real rates used to be negative. They are now positive and high. There was the idea that 6 months ago, interest rates will come down significantly. Now, it's not clear even this year in the US, we will see another interest rate cut. Markets are debating about that. That has huge consequences for countries vulnerable to high borrowing costs, especially lower income economies and lower middle income countries having difficulty in accessing international financial markets. Now, the other important issue, as you see in the middle panel, the number of armed conflict around the world skyrocketed since the pandemic, especially in the Middle East and, of course, the Europe, Central Asia regions of the World Bank. And on the right, you see the ugly face of climate change, the global economy has done very well in one metric, breaking the temperature records every year, you know, in a way very disappointing. We would like to see these numbers actually not breaking records, stabilizing at least, but that hasn't happened yet. And that has huge consequences down the road when we think about the implications, especially, these countries relying on agriculture. And in many places on the world, you have droughts, floods, and of course, the fires. So what is the answer to the first question? We are expecting global growth to remain stable, but subdued relative to pre-pandemic trends. Significant downside risks create this uncertainty around the baseline and, of course, clouding the outlook. Let me turn to the second question. How have these emerging developing economies and low-income countries performed in the first quarter of the century? So the good news is that these economies delivered strong growth in the first decade of the century. Phenomenal growth, highest growth since the 1970s. During that period, from 2000 to, I would say, till the global financial crisis, we had this global consensus. It is good to integrate to the global economy. It's good to undertake reforms. It's good to open up financial markets and the current accounts. And many of these economies took advantage of that period and delivered growth rates close to 6%. The era, I would say, the golden era of globalization. But since then, things have changed. In the meantime, in the 90s, these economies accounted for about 30% global growth. Now they're accounting for 60%. They used to account for about 20% of global exports, now more than 40%, and they are trading a lot with each other. With that, their basically impact on the rest of the world has increased, become meaningful. Still much smaller than the impact of, advanced economies, as you see on the right. So what is the big problem when we think about the first quarter of the century? The big problem is that these economies really lost the momentum when it comes to reforms. External environment has become increasingly more difficult. Investment slowed down, trade slowed down. But more importantly, we saw a sharp slowdown in economic growth. In the 2000s, average growth was around 6%. Now in 2020, so far, growth was below 4% in emerging developing economies. But more importantly, increasingly, long-term growth prospects have diminished. So in the 2000s, forecasters become more and more optimistic about the ability of these economies to deliver growth. At some point, they thought that long-term growth prospects centering around, more than 6%. Now, those numbers are around 3.5%. So we used to think that 10 years ahead, growth in these economies is going to be around 6.5%. Now we are thinking, no, it's going to be around 3.5%. That's a terrible outcome when you think about the consequences of that for the convergence of income levels in these economies to the income levels of advanced economies. And you see that on the right, that convergence rate has declined significantly relative to the pre-pandemic decade in the 2020s. But if you take out China and India, convergence has stopped altogether. If you look at low-income countries and fragile and conflict states, there is actually divergence, not convergence anymore, implying that these economies are becoming poorer relative to advanced economies rather than getting basically closer to per capita income levels of advanced economies. And that has, of course, huge consequences when we think about poverty elimination, when we think about making progress on broader development goals. I would like to talk a little bit about the low-income countries. Those countries, we need to pay attention. They account for 40% of global poor. They account for a sizable share of global population, but they are not getting the type of attention they need to get. At the beginning of the century, we had 63 low-income countries. India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, they were all low-income countries in 2000. They became middle income quickly in the 2000s. But since then, number of countries graduating from low-income country to middle-income country decline the pace of graduation, as you see on the left. Now, we have 26 of them, from 63 to 26. Most of them graduated in the 2000s. But if you look at the middle panel, there has been a huge difference between the performance of those they become middle income countries and those they got stuck in the low income category. Those in the low income category, they haven't made much progress, if any progress at all, over the past 25 years, while those in the middle income category, graduated ones, basically delivered significant growth rates. Going forward, global economy is facing a significant challenge. In the context of these economies, our projections suggest only 6 out of 26 low-income countries have a legitimate shot at graduating by 2050 to middle-income levels. 6 out of 26. Most of these economies, of course, are fragile and conflict states, and 22 out of 26 are in sub-Saharan Africa. So the conflict is a big problem, as you see on the left, when you think about the challenges to graduation. Without, having a stable, secure, peaceful environment, it's difficult to think about macroeconomic stability and growth. If you look at middle panel, food insecurity, by the way, picked up significantly since the pandemic, is exactly in these economies most of the problem, and in fragile and conflict affected areas. These are the countries they are affected the most when it comes to climate events, and the cost of climate events are huge relative to their GDP. Now, let me think broadly emerging market developing economies and the challenges they are facing. The first challenge is that when we think about these economies, they need to basically have access to international financial markets and, of course, trade with the rest of the world. The trade regime, when we compare it, the current environment with the 2000s, totally different. And you see on the left some basic metrics in terms of fragmentation. We are in a different place, very much fragmented trade flows. And in terms of trade policy uncertainty, we have the highest level since the beginning of the century. So the trade, as used to be the engine of growth, will still help, but not at the rate it used to help, given that we see significant slowdown in trade growth relative to what we saw in 2000s. The middle panel is showing you the evolution of debt, the government debt, in emerging developing economies. As you see in 2000s, these economies were able to reduce their debt levels. While they were undertaking reforms, they were basically delivering high growth. In fact, because of that performance, they were able to basically weather the global financial crisis much better than most people expected. But since then, they accumulated significant amount of debt. In fact, last year, their debt level reached a record high in the modern era since 1970. With the increase in interest rates, interest payments went up significantly as well relative to their revenues, as you see on the right. In the 2010s, there was a discussion about growth versus interest rates, how that was a good environment for the governments to borrow. They listened these types of discussions, and they borrowed at the fastest rate we have seen over the past 5 decades. The impact now, most of them have very limited fiscal space to operate. So what is the answer to second question? The performance of these economies, there was strong growth and rapid integration in the 2000s in terms of, expanding their role in the global economy and actually undertaking some reforms that period was the golden era. But since then, emerging developing economies, including low-income countries, they faced a variety of challenges. Growth slowed down, reform momentum got lost, climate change became a much serious issue, and demographic shifts affected many of these countries, and external environment become increasingly more difficult. And based on these trends, we think only small number of low-income countries now have this shot at graduating by 2050 to middle income category. So what are the policy priorities? There, the message is very clear. When you look at how investment climate has evolved, how, for example, corruption control has evolved in emerging market developing economies, some countries have made progress, but in the aggregate, that progress looks very, very small. More progress is needed. Institutions have to become better. These economies have to undertake more reforms to improve their legal systems. They need to become much more attractive when it comes to investment because they need external investment. Now, I mentioned the fiscal policy and how debt levels have increased over time. When you look at the panel, the right panel here, you see government revenues were pretty stable during these 25 years. There has to be much more effort when it comes to revenue mobilization. Government expenditures picked up, that's not a surprise, but we should also ask whether efficiency of government expenditures have increased. The bottom line is that there's a lot of room to undertake policies and improve things in these economies, and that has to come from the domestic policymakers. On the part of low-income countries, as much as they face a lot of challenges, they have incredible opportunities as well. Most of these economies are resource rich. Some of these resources are natural resources. Some of these resources related to their attractiveness as tourism destinations. They need to manage those resources much better. And of course, when you look at the demographic shifts around the world, these economies are the ones that are going to bring the young, basically new entrants to the global labor market. While advanced economies aging, many emerging market developing economies going to face the similar, fate of advanced economies when it comes to aging. As you see on the right, what's happening, the working age population profiles. Low-income countries need to put more effort in the context of education, in the context of health. So these new entrants equipped to basically make the type of contributions we want them to make. They cannot do this alone, of course. They need help from the global community. So what is the big policy message of the kind of the past 25 years? Growth is difficult to generate, and there is no magic pill. There's no Ozempic for economic growth. But there is significant room to improve policy frameworks, to improve institutions, to improve investment climate. So private investment will come. So there's more domestic mobilization of revenues, more efficient use of government resources. And there are also significant synergies among policies. We think about the climate change as a huge challenge, but that challenge comes with a simple, need, infrastructure investment. And that need is not like, you need to build bridges to nowhere. You need to really upgrade infrastructure in some countries. And in some countries, you need to basically have the new infrastructure. And given the, the growth expectations, given the demographic profiles, emerging market developing economies are quite attractive on the paper if they improve, of course, their institutions and domestic legal systems. And global cooperation is key to overcome many of the challenges in the context of course, climate change, in the context of debt, in the context of trade policy. So let me conclude. The first question was, what are the near-term prospects? Growth looks stable, but not good enough, with a lot of uncertainty around and risks still tilted to the downside. How have emerging developing economies performed in the first quarter of this century? phenomenal growth in the first decade, but since then, unfulfilled promise on the part of these economies. They can deliver if they undertake the types of policies that are necessary. There is no shortcut. There is no magic pill to turn the fortunes around. But we know they did it before, they can do it again. So let me use this opportunity, you might all of you, to come and check the Prospects Group publications on a variety of issues. And the good things about these publications, every single figure you see in these publications available on the web page. You can create your own presentations and you can check it out. Let me stop here. Stephanie, back to you. Thank you.
Ayhan, thank you so much for that real tour de force as far as the information that was presented. I do commend the actual report to the audience if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it. I think it's chapter 4 that focuses in particular on the prospects for low-income countries and is an excellent but quite sobering read. I would like to invite the audience. We've got a few questions coming in already, but if you would just use your Q&A button there at the bottom to pose a question to Ayhan. I'd like to start off and just ask kind of a general headline question, which you kind of got at a bit in your presentation. But when you and your team are faced with the prospect of forecasting in the light of such uncertainty, policy uncertainty, and where that policy uncertainty pertains to the very drivers of global growth and growth for EMDs in particular. I'm thinking here of trade, but not only trade. How do you approach forecasting in light of that uncertainty?
And thank you, Stephanie. That's really important, especially the kind of the desire on the part of certain governments to change policies. So the World Bank, like other international organizations, take the legislated policies. This is very important into account when they forecast baseline growth. This is so we are not thinking about the tariff policy would be this way, fiscal policy will be that way. We are thinking basically what has been already legislated and what would be the growth based on that legislation. So that gives us a kind of the baseline profile. After that, we spent a lot of time thinking about the risks. And really, the people who know the kind of these forecasts, you would like to have a good sense of the baseline. But the big story is about the risk and the consequences of risks. So then we have the kind of the menu of exercises depending on the forecast, the risks we have, and we have scenarios around those exercises. So that's the kind of the big story. Let me talk a little bit about the growth here. I think growth, as I mentioned, can surprise on the upside. It did, surprise on the upside multiple times over the past 3 years. And it can surprise on the downside. We have different ways of approaching it. Econometrically, most of the time we think about a fan chart, and that fan chart now, when you look at it, basically shows the risks skewed to the downside. So the likelihood of a weaker growth outcome is higher than the likelihood of a stronger growth outcome. But let me stop there.
Thanks, Ayhan. Yeah, I did want to ask a question too on kind of the potential for upside. I think there's a lot of discussion around the potential for downside scenarios materializing. On the upside scenario, I think you'd mentioned in the presentation, there's the prospect for inflation falling more quickly than forecast, that could then lead to a loosening of global financial conditions as one potential upside. I'm also wondering on the productivity gain side. I think the story has been low productivity growth for a number of years. In the US, you're starting to see productivity gains. I'm wondering how you and your team are thinking about the potential for productivity gains in much of the emerging market and developing economy world.
Uh, Thank you. So the in the context of US, um, the U.S. economy has been really the kind of the one of the bright parts of the global economy. Every year, they delivered growth stronger than what most people expected. In fact, most people expected in 2023 an outright recession that did not materialize. Um, and the productivity growth really played a role. You see productivity growth, I would say, um, the if you compare it with the pre-pandemic average, give and take 30% higher, the growth rate 30% higher. Uh, in the context of the US, the question is whether this is a kind of a cyclical phenomenon or it is more persistent. Because we also saw significant support from the increase in labor supply. There was a significant, in a sense, supply shock to the US economy with the productivity and the labor supply growing. And that made this huge change. This economy, we thought potential growth maybe 1.7, delivering growth around 2.8, while monetary policy tightening significantly. Um, I think that a little bit of that increase in productivity probably persistent. How that part, it has to be really seen, given that productivity is not something we are good at measuring. Now, in the rest of the world, still, you don't have the type of productivity improvements you see in the United States. There could be different reasons for that. In some of these economies, there is a huge challenge in terms of just generating certain amount of growth. You see it especially in Europe. Um, our forecasts for the US this year, moderation in economic growth related to a slowdown basically in labor markets and its implications for consumption from 2.8% of last year to 2.3% this year. Whether the US will continue to deliver the type of growth we have seen, that has huge implications for monetary policy. And I think that based on what we have done, the risks are two-sided. We like the forecast we have. We like where we sit in terms of the numeric conclusion relative to what others have. But as I said, this is an economy going through a structural change when it comes to labor markets. We also need to see the policies of the new administration, how those policies are going to affect productivity and labor markets, because there is a lot of talk with respect to regulation and how those regulations changes will affect productivity. But there's a lot of talk about the labor supply migration policies, how that will have an impact on the supply side of the economy. These things have to be seen. There is, I think, considerable uncertainty.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, I actually think the productivity story in part meshes well with the message you delivered, given a very uncertain external backdrop, the policy advice, and the potential for domestic reforms to actually boost growth. I think, countries that puts them in a position at least to support their growth prospects based on their own domestic policies. So I'm getting some questions in here. So let me go ahead to the audience. The first one here is just asking about how past projections have matched with the actual outturn. And in particularly on the growth front. So what does this tell us about our understanding of the changes, structural changes, I think, that are taking place? So yeah, focus there really just on how actual has compared with the forecast projections.
That's a great question, especially, when we think about this past 25 years. I mean, the near-term forecast can surprise upside, downside, for cyclical reasons. Um, but the question is important to understand these long-term forecasts, Stephanie. We are talking about, this incredible changes when it comes to technology. We are talking about this incredible changes when it comes to productivity, how we work. And I mentioned this long-term growth expectations coming down. So then the question is, how is that possible? How can we square the two?
Mhm.
Because you have economists around telling that there will be huge productivity revolution, more wealth, and at the same time, over the past 20 years, despite all these technological changes, we ended up a weaker growth, realize weaker growth, and people become increasingly more pessimistic about the future. I think that when we study these forecasts, uh, first observation is that these long-term growth forecasts tend to be optimistic. Okay, that's very important to understand. So uh, the the 6 to 10 year ahead forecast tend to be optimistic, and they tend to be downgraded as new data comes and people internalize the changes on the part of labor supply, on the part of capital accumulation, and on the part of productivity growth. I think what is worrying here, uh, our ability remains quite actually constrained when it comes to think about long-term economic growth. And I mentioned what happened in the context of emerging developing economies. Advanced economies as well, they also have that problem in terms of long-term growth prospects falling. Uh, and that's related to, of course, the constraints when it comes to labor supply, but also decline in investment growth, also a slowdown in productivity. So the recent developments in the US economy on the productivity front, on the labor supply front, huge welcome change. I mean, that's the best thing that could happen when you have monetary policy so aggressive, is to have these positive productivity shocks. So in a nutshell, my answer is um, we have still a limited ability to think about 5 to 10 year ahead forecast, and uh, the 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 structural changes we are seeing around us. These changes are not making the life easier in terms of thinking about the future.
I think there's an irony here in that the practitioners of the dismal science tend to be optimistic in their forecast. I mean, I think what I saw and experienced at the fund is oftentimes there's kind of an active scenario, right? There's the forecast kind of embeds in an expectation that reforms will be implemented, and as we know, that's not always the case. The question came in from Whitney Doublewise, actually, that I had the similar question. He asked, you suggest that more global cooperation for addressing trade fragmentation, debt distress, and climate. But what are the realistic prospects for cooperation on trade? And he notes here that the WTO governance system in particular allows any single member to block consensus. There are other global convenings that have a similar kind of consensus approach, which really does seem to impede progress. So I think his question here is how realistic is implementation of that recommendation for more cooperation, given the current state of affairs?
Yeah, I appreciate this question, Whitney, and I think that there are many reasons to worry about the future of global trade system as we know it. Um, Having said that, um, the we need to find ways to make progress. The Despite that fragmentation we see, last year we saw basically the one of the highest numbers of uh, trade restrictions um, in the modern era. The actual highest we saw 23 last year, a bit lower. Uh, and these trade restrictions, by the way, introduced by all types of countries, but especially hurting emerging developing economies. Now, can WTO become effective or not? That's a very difficult question to answer given the state of affairs now. But I would like to talk about how emerging market developed economies respond to this environment. Okay, and there I would like to be optimistic uh, cautiously. So this is a very difficult external environment. It is totally different than what they faced in the 2000s. But that doesn't mean that these economies are helpless bystanders. The large and small countries, they all have an agency to do something about it. So what is that? Number one, I mentioned this increasing intra group trade. You see it in some regions more than others. Emerging markets, developing economies trading a lot with each other. They should basically double down on that. They should have strategic trade and investment partnerships, particularly with their peers. Uh, by the way, this is already happening. Look at Africa, they have continental free trade area. Look at Asia, there are multiple initiatives. They have regional cooperation arrangement, RCEP, they have Trans-Pacific Partnership. They're making progress. European Union signed an agreement with Mercosur. Yes, there is, a lot of headlines when it comes to trade, but countries are trying to integrate. Um, and then, of course, they basically can do things at home. The push trade facilitation, push having better logistics infrastructure so you can reduce the cost of trade from inlands to the ports. Uh, Third, diversify your trade, push services. A number of countries, we see this incredible momentum when it comes to services trade. And basically, because of digitalization, services trade become the kind of the main growth driver. Uh, and eventually, they need to, of course, push these international organizations, WTO, World Bank, IMF, to be active the advocate for these economies and push the frontier when it comes to a global trade system that is based on rules and a system that is functioning. Is it easy to get there? Not necessarily, but we had that era. And that era was a golden era for the global economy, for advanced economies as well as for emerging developing economies.
Yeah, I think and Jerry, I saw Jerry Rice had a similar question on that. I think you answered it, and I'm also reminded of the fact that regional integration efforts. Certainly an issue among EMDEs, but also, Europe comes to mind as far as, areas that could have more integration that would support their growth and also global growth as a result. There was a question here that was an interesting one around the global competition for foreign direct investment, whether we're talking about advanced economies or low income countries. The question to you is who wins and how? So a big question there, but maybe any comments or thoughts about how countries are competing for foreign direct investment and which policies might stand to help pull in more FDI.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie. Let me quickly talk about Jerry's last question. And let me thank, of course, to Jerry for helping us to organize this event. Now, there is this big debate about the Bretton Woods institutions, what they should do. the at the core, these institutions have well-defined mandates, and IMF as well as the World Bank, and it is going to be more important than ever for them to deliver their core mandate. Uh, and we used to think, in mid 2000s, uh, the global financial markets matured. There was not much of a demand for IMF resources. Soon after that, we had the global financial crisis. Jerry and I, we were there. Stephanie, we were there. So we might think that, um, this is a different era. And then we learn that these institutions are still quite important. Uh, Beyond that, collaboration and efficiency going to be critical for both of these institutions and other IFIs and MDBs. But when I think about the kind of the picture we have in this report, how critical for these economies to deliver on the part of reforms, to deliver on the part of macro stability, structural front. There is so much to be done in emerging developing economies, low-income countries, and these are the basically institutions equipped to do that. FDI question is very important. I talked about the slowdown in investment. You look at FDI. In 2007, FDI actually to these countries peaked relative to their GDP. And then in 2020s, we have this, the lowest levels of FDI relative to their size. Um, Now, when we think about who has the potential to generate growth, there is no question the growth potential is much higher in these economies, especially frontier markets, low-income countries. But they need to do more to attract FDI. And I'm not going to say, who wins, who loses, because there is this issue whether in the global trade we have this zero-sum outcomes. Obviously, uh, we think, and the kind of the basic arithmetic clearly shows that, and the theory and empirical evidence, uh, overall, global economy wins, advanced economies wins, as well as these economies win. Um, so the challenge going forward in an environment, there is still ample private investment available, private funds available, these economies making the necessary improvements and differentiating them. There are countries, they are delivering incredible growth. India, uh, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, in different regions, Rwanda, you look at their growth numbers, quite significant. And take, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, the three of those countries, they have close to 500 million people. In Africa, we have countries delivering high growth rates. So these are attractive destinations, but we want more. And we think that there is a lot of basically potential to be exploited in these economies.
I know we're running short on time here. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't just at least pose a question to you on debt sustainability and some thoughts about, in particular, the low income countries that are either in or at risk of debt distress. If you could touch on kind of the link between indebtedness and growth prospects, and what the advice is to these heavily indebted countries, as well as what the bank can do in assisting them.
Yeah. Great. It's very important. Obviously, we are getting ready for Financing for Development Conference in June. Very important milestone when we think about what's going on. We just, completed our IDA round. We really studied these issues inside out. The first question, the answer is very simple. Countries that have that difficulty delivered much weaker growth than other economies since the beginning of the pandemic. They did not recover in the way the other countries recovered. So this debt overhang is a huge problem in the context of low-income countries and some low middle-income countries, lower middle-income countries. Now, the challenge is that at the country level, you need to look at each country and make a call. Is this a sustainable, is this a solvency problem or a liquidity problem? Um, we would like to think that it's a liquidity problem, but if the problem is there year in, year out for many years, we need to think about how we are going to solve the problem in a way that opens the kind of the door for these economies to deliver growth, because these interest rate payments, the debt payments, have been squeezing the resources necessary for education and health services. On the part of World Bank, um, we became basically the entity, especially through IDA, helping these economies more than any other entity, including private sector, especially those countries that have serious debt challenges. Basically, IDA became the number one funding source for these economies. And we are thinking that going forward, we need to be even more aggressive, not just financing, but in terms of improving the capacity. We see quite a bit of space on that one. And they deliver, they have better debt management, and they have much better fiscal policy frameworks. The most important point is that global community needs to help these economies. And because of this demographic dividend I mentioned, the problems of these countries are not national problems. These are the global problems, and it will require global community to be really very, very, in a sense, aggressive in terms of helping them.
Well, Ayhan, we're both at time, and I actually think that last point is a perfect way to conclude the session. I am reminded of how interconnected these issues are around fiscal space, around macro policies that are consistent with stability, and actually allow for investment that leads to future growth. And that growth not only is good for the domestic economy, but also for the global economy and global stability. So you got a lot packed into 1 hour there, Ayhan. I really do appreciate you joining this group and speaking with us today. I do recommend the report to this audience, and in particular, Chapter 4 I'd mentioned before is quite illuminating. And yeah, I'm glad that the update comes out in June. I hope you'll be willing to come back and join this group again. But thanks to everybody for joining us, Ayhan. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you all colleagues. I hope to see some of you around. I see a number of ex-fund, ex-bank colleagues. I really appreciate the opportunity, and have a wonderful weekend.